Welcome everyone to this month's Woolf Post-Kantian Philosophy Seminar. Our previous sessions have been recorded and are available on the Woolf YouTube site, and this session will be as well. Our speaker today is Professor Simon Glendinning of the London School of Economics. Professor Glendinning works in continental philosophy, primarily phenomenology and deconstruction. He's the author of a number of books, including On Being with Others, Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and Derrida, The Idea of Continental Philosophy, In the Name of Phenomenology, Derrida, A Very Short Introduction. He's also edited the volumes Arguing with Derrida, Derrida's Legacies, Literature and Philosophy, and most recently, he's the author of a very large and interesting two-volume work entitled Europe, A Philosophical History. And today, he's going to deliver a paper called Eurocentrism and Anti-Eurocentrism in Europe, which I understand is a piece that is in progress with a co-author who thankfully is here to join us as well, along with Simon. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Simon.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm immediately going to share a screen just for a moment because it's something important I need to show everyone on some very lo-fi graphic here, which is the title of the piece, Eurocentrism and Anti-Eurocentrism in Europe. Now that specification of Europe is going to be very important, and it'd be worth everybody who's following this to keep note of that. I mean, I will stress it as we go along, but it's Eurocentrism and Anti-Eurocentrism in Europe. And the second thing to see is that I'm not the sole author of the paper from which this talk's derived. It's co-authored with my colleague at the LSE, Cristobal Garibay-Peterson, who I'm very pleased to say is here too. And if I get stuck at any point in question and answer, I'm sure Cristobal will be able to help out. Right. Well, so Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism in Europe. Well, as an accusation or just a descriptive assessment, it's probably a commonplace today to suppose that anti-Eurocentrism is in general far less problematic an attitude than Eurocentrism. However, the histories and cultural shapings of anti-Eurocentric ideas are various, and contemporary opposition to Eurocentrism is differently motivated and shaped in different cultural variations. And anti-Eurocentrism, as it's found in Europe, may be thought especially distinctive, where it's also shaped by historical guilt and shame. And there is a good deal to guiltily remember here from Europe's history, memories of totalitarianism, genocides, the Shoah, colonization, all of those at the very least. But the enormity of its historical guilt is not the fundamental ground of Europe's distinction in this context, though confronting that guilty history is indeed very unavoidably necessary. Running much deeper, we're going to argue, and I will say we on behalf of Cristobal as we go along, running much deeper, we will argue, is a specific conception of history itself. Indeed, a specifically European conception of history as the history of man. And it's in terms of this understanding of history that both Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism have been framed in Europe. This framing is far more basic to European thinking about Europe than a mere attitude one may or may not adopt. And for that reason, it presents a powerful challenge to legitimate hopes to go beyond Eurocentrism in Europe. It's this framing and that challenge that I'm going to speak to today. Well, to make our way to an articulation of this specifically European framing that we want to address, I'm going to begin with a passage from a standard history book, Norman Davis's book, Europe, A History, and in its introduction, a passage which summarizes Eurocentrism and opposition to Eurocentrism across the globe today. The passage is striking for a number of reasons, not least because it suggests that the anti-Eurocentrism in Europe has no specific shaping beyond its connection with guilt and shame. Now, the passage is, we think, rather troubling and inadequate, but it nevertheless brings into view something of the variety of kinds of Eurocentrism, and I'm going to share this passage with you here. This is Norman Davis. Opposition to Eurocentrism comes at present from four main sources. In North America, it has emerged from that part of the Black community and their political sympathizers who are rebelling against an educational system allegedly dominated by white supremacist values. In its most militant form, it is based on the contention that European civilization has stolen the birthright of mankind, and of Africans in particular. In the world of Islam, especially in Iran, a similar opposition is mounted by religious fundamentalists who see the West as the domain of Satan. Elsewhere in the Third World, it is espoused by intellectuals, often of a Marxian complexion, who regard Eurocentric views as part and parcel of capitalist ideology. In Europe, it is widespread, though not always well articulated, in a generation which, when they pause to think, have been thoroughly ashamed of many of their elders' attitudes. Well, there he talks then about four main sources. Well, perhaps there are four main sources, but Davis might have sketched a more judicious conception of what is at issue had he given prominence to what is nevertheless visible in his own description. There's more than one opposition to Eurocentrism, more than one anti-Eurocentrism, more than one cultural configuration of opposition to Eurocentrism, and something very distinctive about the anti-Eurocentrism that is found and articulated in Europe. Well, we're interested in these cultural differences, but that's not to say we think they have nothing in common. In general, Eurocentrism defines Europe in terms that puts greatest weight on its comparative achievements. And anti-Eurocentrism defines Europe in terms that places greatest weight on its comparative crimes. On the other hand, it seems quite wrong to suppose that there are something like four sources of that conception. There are, we believe, four variations, at least, in view here. Anti-Eurocentrism is not one thing, not one program, not one outlook, not a single perspective with various sources, each feeding the same opposition. On the contrary, it's formed and forged in different ways, in different cultural configurations, and in view of different histories, indeed in different senses of history itself, and the meaning of the human being. And in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on a distinctively European framing of anti-Eurocentrism. And the basic argument will be that the anti-Eurocentrism that is, as Davis says, widespread in Europe is shaped differently than all the others. Shaped not only by distinctive historical memories and the shame connected to them, but by a distinctive conception of history itself. Davis says that anti-Eurocentrism in Europe is not always well articulated. Well, that may be true, but its every articulation or inarticulation has, we think, one basic pattern or schema, and it's a pattern that can be best described as Rousseauist, following Rousseau, Rousseauist. We'll explain this and then consider what it might mean to retain an opposition to Eurocentrism in Europe beyond that pattern. Well, this opposition between Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism, as it's found in Europe, is remarked on very strikingly in a passage of a book by Jacques Derrida called The Other Heading. And I'm going to share a quotation from early on in that book in which he addresses that opposition. Is there, then, a completely new today of Europe beyond all the exhausted programs of Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism? These exhausting yet unforgettable programs. We cannot and must not forget them, since they do not forget us. Am I taking advantage of the we when I begin saying that, in knowing them now by heart and to the point of exhaustion, since these unforgettable programs are exhausting and exhausted, we, today, no longer want either Eurocentrism or anti-Eurocentrism? Now, Derrida's going to point up a kind of uncanny likeness between the two sides of this European self-understanding. There certainly are two opposed sides here, two programs. But as we're going to see, in Derrida's view, each one is the mirror of the other. And as such, they belong together. Two basic expressions of the same European subject, articulating feelings, beliefs, passions, and sentiments that uneasily cohabit in the selfhood of the European self. Now, they're sometimes more self-congratulatory and backslapping. That would be the Eurocentric side. Sometimes they're more self-hating and self-accusing, and that would be the anti-Eurocentric side. Now, the idea that there's an underlying unity to the two sides of this European mind, an internal relationship between these two opposed programs, is, we believe, a central claim in Derrida's thinking about Europe. And this is especially noteworthy because he is more often than not straightforwardly positioned on just one side of this debate, the anti-Eurocentric side. So seeing him here as wanting to go beyond both Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism may seem a bit of a surprise, and indeed not without good reason. And again, let me share the screen here to show you some reason. From an interview at the end of his life, he said, "Since the very beginning of my work, and this would be deconstruction itself, I have remained extremely critical with regard to Europeanism or Eurocentrism. Since the beginning, since the very beginning." Indeed, in the opening lines of one of his earliest books, Of Grammatology, he's explicit about this, stating as a main aim to focus on what he there calls the powerful ethnocentrism that belongs to the history of the only metaphysics, an ethnocentrism that is in the process of imposing itself on the world. So Derrida's opposition to Eurocentrism or Western ethnocentrism is beyond question, but much less well known, much less well recognized is his identification of an anti-ethnocentrism or anti-Eurocentrism within the same history of the only metaphysics, a specifically European anti-ethnocentrism or anti-Eurocentrism with respect to which he is also extremely critical. Good example of this comes in the text of Grammatology that I've just mentioned here. I'll share this one, where he talks about Claude Lévi-Strauss, and he says, "One already suspects that the critique of ethnocentrism, a theme so dear to Lévi-Strauss, has most often the sole function of constituting the other as a model of original and natural goodness, of accusing and humiliating oneself, of exhibiting its being unacceptable in an anti-ethnocentric mirror. Rousseau would have taught the modern anthropologist this humility of one who knows he is unacceptable, this remorse that produces anthropology." In later writings, Derrida would more often speak simply of Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism, but whether he speaks of ethnocentrism Western ethnocentrism and anti-ethnocentrism, or Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism in Europe, it's the same basic idea. In Europe, Eurocentrism and its anti-Eurocentric mirror constitute in their opposition what he calls one of the fundamental schemas of the metaphysical heritage that structures all European thinking about Europe. A fundamental schema that he sought in his work of deconstruction to go beyond, aiming to go beyond the exhausted and exhausting programs of Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism that have hitherto dominated European thought about Europe. These are European programs that belong together, he suggests, in what might be called the age of Rousseau that we still inhabit. Well, what is the significance of Rousseau here? In Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages, Rousseau had attempted to provide a universal genealogy of human historical development, and he advanced an account of prehistoric humanity of passing naturally through two stages, from an originally savage condition and thence into what he called a barbarian stage of natural indolence, where humanity will have lived its youth in golden centuries, centuries in which man simply lived according to his nature. Rousseau's question was, what in such a fully natural golden life could possibly lead it out of itself and into history proper? Rousseau refers then to what he calls the touch of a finger, such a slight movement, which would nevertheless set off a world-changing development, deciding, he says, the whole vocation of mankind. As Derrida comments, this slight movement seems to produce a revolution out of nothing. It is essentially exterior to the world, the golden age, whose axis it shifts. Although Rousseau does not name the one who willed man to be social, Derrida concludes that while it is perhaps not God, since it's an originary evil and opening onto alienation from its natural condition, from a life in which man lived according to his nature, nevertheless, it probably is God, since a movement of the finger is enough for God to move the world. A conclusion more emphatically affirmed by Rousseau in the fragment on climates, where he explicitly recalls that he could tip the axis of the world with a finger, which would be the same thing as for God to say to man, cover the world and be social. And Derrida concludes this discussion with this thought. It certainly concerns God, for the genealogy of evil is also a theodicy, the catastrophic origin of societies and languages at the same time permitted the actualization of the potential faculties that slept inside man. Only a chance cause could actualize natural powers which did not carry within themselves a sufficient motivation for awakening them to their own end. A Rousseau story here of the development of historical humanity from its prehistorical condition of natural indolence, thus, as Derrida puts it, naturalizes the biblical incident. Rousseau makes a natural accident of the fall. And while Rousseau sees society as it develops in the history of Europe, with its attendant ethnocentrism as a sort of sickness and alienation of primitive man, he also presents the history and progress of tongues that takes place there as a natural progress of reason. Through this progress, man breaks away from the state of natural contentment, while simultaneously seeking a return to that state so that the selfishness and isolation that develop in the process of history of reason might finally be overcome in a process of the de-alienation of rational man. For now, civilized man, a gap or gulf emerges between nature and reason, between a natural life and a rational life, and Rousseau will try to comprehend it by providing a developmental account of reason in history as an exit from nature after the catastrophic event at the origin, in all but name the history of man after the fall. In view in that history is an increasing alienation from the natural life of golden harmony, which is also, and at once, a progressive de-alienation of rational man, with European societies at the front of this world historical development of the self-realization of rational humanity. The touch of a finger that interrupted the state of nature opens a movement of a redemptive return of man to himself as a rational being, a return to natural harmony, but now in a higher form, and this taking place first in Europe. Well, this is the classical modern understanding of universal history as the unfolding of God's plan for humanity, the history of man as a passage from an origin in a primitive state, a state of nature, towards the redemptive emancipation of reason in a finally perfected state of society, now set into a putatively naturalized world history. And we should see how Derrida concludes on that thought. Despite its naturalized historiography, a teleological and eschatological anticipation superintends Rousseau's entire discourse. And not just Rousseau's, we're saying. This archaeo-teleo-eschatological conception of the history of man articulates the basic pattern of all European thinking of Europe in its history, the very language of its language, in Eurocentric thinking in Europe, where Europe is defined primarily in terms of its achievements. It is a Rousseauism that sets its stall on world history as the progressive de-alienation of rational man, with the European at the front. In anti-Eurocentric thinking in Europe, where Europe is defined primarily in terms of its crimes, it is a Rousseauism that sets its stall on world history as the alienation of primitive man, the non-European closer to the natural origin. On this distinctively European anti-Eurocentrism, the non-European other is positioned, as Derrida put it, as a model of original and natural goodness in relation to which the European knows that he, the European, is unacceptable. This is indeed a program of two programs, but one a mirror of the other. And it's a program of two programs that we should indeed want to go beyond. Well, how might this passage to a beyond of the two programs be achieved? There seem to us to be four logical possibilities here, which I'm going to share with you. We're going to spend some time with these four. Number one, we think of the movement to the beyond, that's beyond Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism. We think of the movement to the beyond as belonging to the standpoint of the Eurocentric program. Two, we think of the movement to the beyond as belonging to the standpoint of the anti-Eurocentric program. Three, we think of the movement to the beyond as belonging to the standpoint of both. 4, we think of the movement to the beyond as belonging to the standpoint of neither. as I say, 4 logical possibilities of thinking what would belong to this passage to the beyond of Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism, this Rousseauist pattern in Europe. Well, perhaps no single thinker sits fairly and squarely within just one of these position types. Often it's a matter of an overall emphasis in a thinker rather than an emphatic affirmation. Each of 1 to 4 here concerns a position that we might, however, associate with certain thinkers, even if it would be somewhat unfair simply to identify them with it. And we're going to go through this association now. The basic outline of each type and their argument can be sketched with reference to these representative examples. I'm going to begin with 1, where we think of the movement to the beyond as belonging to the standpoint of the Eurocentric program. So it's the Eurocentric program itself which is going to take us beyond what we currently have as this opposition between Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism. If 1 is the case, its being so would amount to the Eurocentric program insisting that we can leave behind Europe's old and shameful narrowness by moving on to a bright new future of, say, universal freedom, a freedom that made its first appearance in Europe. Europe is, on this picture, great, so great, in fact, that it has always contained within itself the intellectual resources to think itself beyond its old prejudices. Going beyond the old program of Eurocentrism would mean here simply for Europe to extend its attained or soon to be attained condition to all those who have not yet attained it and are historically still distant from it. It would be a call for the Europeanization of the world. But one would have to say that this is not beyond Eurocentrism at all. It simply reaffirms it. Europe is the end. Europe remains the end. Everyone else is playing catch-up. Well, that is a position we can associate with Hegel. What about the second one, where we think of the movement to the beyond Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism, as belonging to the standpoint of the anti-Eurocentric program? So we're going to drive through that to get beyond both. If 2 is the case, its being so would amount to the anti-Eurocentric program insisting that each and all of Europe's old concepts is exhausted and done for. Europe is moribund. Nothing new can stem from it. We have to leave it behind for good. Europe is not great, so not great, in fact, that it is entirely devoid of both the intellectual resources and the will to think itself beyond its old prejudices. Going beyond the old program of Eurocentrism would imply here denying Europe the possibility of ever being anything other than a rotting corpse, something to be confined to the past. Well, it's worth noting that unlike 1, this is indeed a beyond for Europe, but one that the beyondness of which is in principle not available to Europe anymore. It is a beyond from which Europe itself will be forsaken. Europe is dead. Europe remains dead. Only the non-European promises a future. This is a position we can associate with Enrique Dussel. But, again, one might say one cannot claim to go beyond Eurocentrism in Europe if there's no European future, no to come for Europe, with all its memories in that development. Well, what of 3? We think that the movement to the beyond as belonging to the standpoint of both, beyond both, from the standpoint of both Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism in Europe. If 3 is the case, its being the case amounts to insisting on the necessity to acknowledge that both of the old programs really are interlocked elements of Europe's identity. Europe is not however, simply dead. It remains alive and is still capable of recalling itself to what in itself calls it to go beyond its previously constituted identity. This way of thinking, a Europe beyond Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism, insists on the possibility of thinking entirely outside the old programs, while nonetheless remaining unwilling to give up on the possibility that that beyond lies within them. This is a position we can associate with Rodolphe Gachet. It concerns a beyond that is available to Europe and which comes from inside the language of Europe's language about Europe. I won't make any further comment on that for the moment and move on to the fourth, where we think of the movement to the beyond as belonging to the standpoint of neither Eurocentrism nor anti-Eurocentrism in Europe. If 4 is the case, its being the case amounts to denying that the old programs of Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism in Europe can ever overcome themselves. Europe's intellectual resources and willpower are by themselves insufficient to think Europe's beyond. Europe is not dead, but it remains fundamentally stuck in the old programs, and it can free up a future beyond them only by introducing something decidedly non-European into its thinking, something providing the resources for what has been called an indigenous critique of European thinking. This is a position we might associate with David Graeber and David Wengrow. Europe cannot will itself out of its old prejudices, and even if it could will that, it would nevertheless lack the conceptual apparatus and resources of its own to do so. This is a European beyond, the beyondness of which is retained, and it is retained for Europe, but it is retained in the acknowledgement of Europe's incapacity to think from itself the unmarked space that lies outside Europe and its own intellectual traditions. So that's our 4 possibilities and 4 people who are associated with them. Well, we do not think it is credible to endorse any of these positions. The first 2 do not project a beyond for Europe at all. And the second 2 do so only at the cost of reproducing the very Rousseauism they want to escape. This is evident in the restricted character of the affirmations in both 3 and 4. Going beyond the old programs is possible, they say, but depends on finding resources that lie, for position 3, inside the language of Europe. Only inside Europe can we do it. Inside the language of Europe and Europe's language about Europe. And for position 4, it must be found outside Europe, not inside Europe, outside Europe and its own intellectual traditions. Here we see in 3 and 4 a reproduction of the Eurocentrism on the one side and the anti-Eurocentrism on the other. But is there really any reason to suppose that either of those limiting restrictions, only inside or only outside, are a requirement of the task of thinking beyond? We think not. And in fact, we think that an unrestricted combination of 3 and 4 seems to us to be the most promising position to adopt. As we shall see, this is not simply a matter of distributing the largesse with a kind of ecumenical even-handedness. Moreover, while 3 is often associated with deconstruction, and I mentioned Rodolphe Gachet in relation to it earlier, we think that the combination view of 3 and 4 without limitation is a position that is explicitly endorsed by Derrida himself. In the passage from the other heading with which we began, Derrida speaks of Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism as being unforgettable. We take this to imply that both of these must be recalled in the attempt to go beyond them, not to resentfully oppose or simply reject either, but to acknowledge them both as both one's own and in need of overcoming. In the unrestricted affirmation of both 3 and 4 that we're arguing for, the thinking that thinks the beyond of Europe finally starts wondering what the point is of resenting what one is. In summary, then, we want to affirm the following 2 modes of thinking beyond Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism in and for Europe. First, a position that refuses to give up on the possibility of generating new meaning from inside the language of European thinking about Europe, from inside that Rousseauist configuration, i.e. embracing the unrestricted version of our 3rd variation of going beyond. And second, a position that recognizes the possibility of finding resources for thinking about Europe from outside that language, i.e. embracing the unrestricted version of our 4th variation of going beyond. These 2 positions and the unrestricted affirmation of 3 and 4 that they involve are, it seems to us, both in play in Derrida's book, The Other Heading. There he invites us to affirm what might remain to come for Europe from what he calls another shore, from outside Europe. But from outside, he says, in 2 senses. On one, from developments hitherto unknown to Europeans that might come to Europe from non-European cultures, and from developments hitherto unanticipated by Europeans that might come to Europe from inside its own culture. Speaking to a conception of Europe's cultural particularity that construes it in terms of its having attained an orientation to human universality, Derrida does not simply dismiss or reject that conception, but he refuses to limit himself to it. This conception of what is inside Europe, that is, a conception of Europe's particularity being construed in terms of its having attained an orientation towards human universality. And that, of course, is absolutely the essence of the Rousseauist program, of the movement of humanity, of the whole of humanity towards the de-alienation of rational man. So thinking about Europe's particularity as it's having attained an orientation towards that end, towards human universality, Derrida does not simply dismiss or reject that conception, but he refuses to limit himself to it. He says, this conception of what is inside Europe is not one I wish to criticize here. I would even be ready to subscribe to it. Incidentally, that subscribing to it, he subscribes to when he says things like, philosophy is making a contribution to human universality. That is a kind of absolute sort of commitment that he has there. I would even be ready to subscribe to it, but with one hand only, for I keep another to write or look for something else, perhaps outside Europe, not only in order to look in the way of research, analysis, knowledge, and philosophy, for what is already found outside Europe, but not to close off in advance a border to the future, to the to come of the event, to that which comes perhaps, and perhaps comes from a completely other shore. So the outside Europe that Derrida has in view here takes in something of both 3 and 4 of our conceptions. Not only 4, which concerned itself only with what might be found in the resources of non-European cultures, but also 3, itself concerned only with what might yet be made from the resources of European culture. But Derrida doesn't take this outside Europe to be limited in one respect or the other, neither spatially outside Europe or cultural spatially, nor temporally in terms of a possible future. Well, for his own part, Derrida considered finding a decent strategy of refined resistance towards Eurocentrism, a strategy of refined resistance which he says didn't just wind up repeating the old programs, as that finding such a strategy he regarded as among the most difficult tasks facing us today. The difficulty resides in finding ourselves caught up in a tension generated by two completely unavoidable desiderata. One, insisting that we go beyond Europe's modern Rousseauist self-understanding. The other, insisting that this beyond remains a beyond for Europe, for that Europe with all its memories, with its constitutional Rousseauist self-understanding. So both beyond that Europe and a beyond that remains a beyond for Europe, for a Europe to come. It is, we believe, with a strategy that can look outside Europe in the double sense that we've outlined in this lecture, that a still recognizably European position can, in our time, make its way in a manner that is indeed extremely critical of both Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism in Europe. We glimpse the possibility of taking a step towards an attainable, but as yet unattained condition for Europe beyond its modern, its Rousseauist formation. Thank you very much. So that's me done. I'm actually much quicker than I thought I was going to be, 42 minutes.
Thank you, Simon. Wonderful lecture. There's, I think, much to discuss. I have a number of questions I might ask. One initial question I have is, you had quite a bit to say about Derrida, who, of course, is most famously associated with deconstruction, but at least in his earlier work, he has a pretty strong association with the phenomenological tradition, as I'm sure you're aware. I'm wondering where you would situate someone like Husserl and then furthermore Heidegger. I'm thinking Husserl falls into this first camp, a thinker who's committed to the idea that the particularity of Europe consists in its sort of aspiration or orientation to human universality, particularly with his conception of reason. And I think it's something I think that Derrida is critical of in Husserl. And then I wonder what's going on with Derrida's take on Heidegger. Is there some kind of universality that's at stake in Heidegger that Derrida is ambivalent toward? I'm thinking here of a text from Derrida, The Ends of Man, which I think is from the late 60s or early 70s. So anyway, any kind of thoughts you have about
Stephen,
Derrida's...
as you were speaking, I literally wrote down The Ends of Man on my piece of paper, because I think that this would be a text that, if one was to explore Derrida's relation precisely to that phenomenological heritage, is where to go. But let's think about that title for a moment. It's one that is in some ways echoed and anticipated in the lecture as I gave it, because if one has a Rousseauist conception, if our thinking about Europe, as it were, belongs to an age of Rousseau, then it also belongs, as it were, constitutively with a picture of human history with an origin and an end. So there would be an origin of man, a beginning for man, which in the lecture I tried to unpack a little bit in Rousseau as something like a naturalized version of the fall, where there's a human break with a merely natural condition, and so for the first time, as it were, becoming human. And then a history of man, which is the development of the reason in man towards an end. And the end of man, it would be perhaps a word that I mentioned in the lecture of a teleology, a telos, a goal towards which history is heading. In fact, Derrida uses the word teleo-eschatological when he's talking about Rousseau here. So you have a teleo-eschatological anticipation in Rousseau's meant to be naturalistic conception of human history. And this teleo-eschatological anticipation is precisely the anticipation of an end. And it would be this redemptive end in which you attain to the de-alienation of rational humanity. Now, in Husserl, as I think you've indicated, this is almost exactly how it would be characterized for him. History is the history of the unfolding of reason in time, and it's the movement of humanity becoming what it in a certain way already is, a rational creature. And rational humanity for Husserl develops first and only in Europe. And the movement of world history is also a movement of the Europeanization of the whole world. So we have in Husserl a profoundly classical thinker of the end of man. Now, you raised this great question, Stephen, about where Heidegger lies with this. And I must say this is both complicated and straightforward. And I'm going to give the straightforward bit first, and then I'd like to acknowledge, as Derrida would, a complication. Is there an end of man in, like a telos or an eschaton in Heidegger? In the ends of man, Derrida says there is something like that. And he characterizes it in terms of what it is that defines man for Heidegger. What defines man for Heidegger is not the possession of reason, but what Heidegger calls nearness to being. So man is defined for Heidegger in a relation to being. And in Heidegger's early work, Being and Time, it's the idea that the entity that we are, what we've hitherto called man, is a being which only is in virtue of its possessing an understanding of being. It's this closeness. Being is what is closest to us. We are, and we are in such a way that being is disclosed to us. So nearness to being is that which defines man, just as rational animal, as it were, is what defines man in the more traditional tradition. And just as in the more traditional tradition, the end of history is man becoming the rational animal that he already is, in Heidegger, a kind of end of history would be achieving that nearness to being, which in fact we are most distant from today. So Heidegger begins his early work saying, the question of being has been entirely forgotten. That which is closest to us is most distant. And it would be overcoming that most distantness of being, attaining to closeness to being, that would be the end of man in a Heideggerian variation. So the sort of straight answer is that there is indeed an analogue to a Husserlian end of history in Heidegger, which is the attainment of nearness to being, which in a certain way is our destiny. And indeed, Heidegger thinks in some way works itself out historically in Germany. So again, in Europe, in the middle of Europe, in fact, in the German middle, that is the middle of Europe. The complication, of which there are a number, but the one that I'd like to at least note, and that Derrida would too, is that Heidegger defines the entity that we are not as man. Man is the anthropos, man is the rational animal, as it were. Heidegger thinks that that anthropology is actually what confuses us about what we are. And he says that we have to understand ourselves otherwise. And he calls the entity that we are, in order to try to develop an understanding of the entity that we are, Dasein. And Dasein, in a certain way, is not man. Dasein is the entity that is in an understanding of being, and all that story I gave of nearness to being. Dasein is that entity. That entity is not man, not this animal with a capacity for logos or reason. But it's nothing other than man. It is the entity that we are. So it's both, one has to say, in Heidegger's account, a quite radical departure from, I mean, perhaps the most radical departure from the kind of phenomenological heritage that Husserl established, where Husserl is really picking up on a Western tradition that goes back to the Greeks and its Latin appropriation in ideas of the rational animal, or animal rationale. Husserl, a much more traditional figure of the tradition, of which Heidegger, perhaps more than, and Derrida would often say better than anyone else, has begun to disclose to us as a tradition through rethinking ourselves as Dasein. But even in Heidegger, we find some analogue of the end of man, which would be the attainment of nearness to being, which would be the destiny of the entity that we are, a destiny of Dasein now, not man, but Dasein, and the passage to that end belonging first and above all to Germany, not even just Europe, but Germany. It's a much more tricky position there. But that I think is the answer to your question, and you're absolutely right, Stephen, that it's in the early essay by Derrida, The Ends of Man, in which he spells that out. And I think one of his closing thoughts in there, which he develops elsewhere perhaps a little more, is that he's inviting us to think through Heidegger in a way, the end of man. The end of man has been the way of thinking through which Europe has understood itself. It's understood itself as been at the head of the pack in the movement to the end of world history. If we want to go beyond that, we've got to begin to think the beyond of the end of man. So what would a history be? What would our history be that would no longer have this teleo-eschatological shape? Now, that's a very profound question and a difficult one. And I don't think Derrida regarded it as easy at all to say, as it were, in some kind of maxim or slogan, what it would be to think the end of man, or the beyond of the end of man. But I think everything he was doing, this whole deconstruction thing, was this effort to find, in this double way, both inside that tradition and perhaps from outside too, ways of thinking through which this passage to the beyond might be thought.
Thanks. Just a follow-up. So part of the story you're telling has to do, as you say, with this sort of Rousseauist inheritance of this idea of humanity, European humanity, consisting of an origin, some kind of progress, and more specifically, a progress to an end, to a telos. And so I wonder, in your view of what it would mean to think of this beyond, for Rousseau and the tradition you mentioned, there are certain ways of characterizing humanity, essentially, right? So there is a human nature of some kind. Of course, the thinkers who belong to this tradition may disagree about what that nature is, but they're still more or less committed in some sense to the idea that there is a human nature. And then, of course, one of the ways in which that nature tends to be framed by a number of these thinkers is in terms of reason. So what then does a beyond of the end of man in this European context look like if we're no longer going to be appealing to essentialist conceptions of nature or reason, or is that the idea to completely jettison, or is it to somehow preserve them but appeal to something else? Or I mean, I think this is kind of what Heidegger's doing, right? This is why what Derrida's picking up on is this kind of ambivalence in Heidegger himself, is there's this essentialist tendency to say, well, we are all the same. We're all human insofar as we're Dasein, we're near to being, and yet at the same time, that kind of way of looking at what it means to be the kinds of beings we are no longer lends itself to the kind of commonsensical traditional notion of human nature we once had or once committed to. So yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts about that, about
Yeah,
what the human looks.
I do have some. It's not easy. That one thing I think it worth noting is that Derrida says that he's exploring a self-understanding of the European West that belongs to the age of Rousseau that we still inhabit. But it's very evident that in Derrida's view, the age of Rousseau is not in great shape, that this self-understanding, as he puts it in some of the quotes I read out today, is exhausted and exhausting. I mean, let's just hold the first part of this. It's exhausted. So instead of being a conception of what it is to be a human being that we all inhabit in some sense of, oh, it's obvious, we're confident about it, everybody knows that a human being is a rational animal, that we're all the same, that human beings as rational creatures are varied all over the world, but the Europeans are the most advanced, the most civilized, who've attained the best, most progressive standpoint of the history of this animal. That kind of vision of world history and Europe's place in world history is not in good shape. Now, one way this has been expressed is to say this is not in great shape, not because people like Derrida or other thinkers, Heidegger or whoever, have attacked it and criticized it and bashed it about a bit so that, you know, wrong-thinking people have begun to see that we shouldn't think that way anymore. No, it's unraveling inside itself, out under its own steam, as it were. Now, one of the ways this is described, and it's a way, Stephen, that I know you know that I've communicated with you elsewhere, is that one can describe our time as one in which a certain kind of meta-narrative through which we understand who we are and what we do is beginning to become incredible to us, no longer believable. And it's not no longer believable because there are these great critics of it who, you know, stab at its logical faults or even just political faults or so on. No, there has been a historical development of becoming unbelievable of the whole basic framework through which we've understood our lives. That idea of calling it a meta-narrative comes from Jean-François Lyotard in his book, which is called The Postmodern Condition. And he defines like the modern way of thinking as the one where there is superb confidence in that conception of ourselves. A superb confidence in what he calls a philosophy of history. And the philosophy of history there that is absolutely central would be this progressive story from a primitive beginning to a rational civilized end with the European at the front. It's that, let's call it now, the meta-narrative of history through which the Europeans have understood themselves and every other that is falling apart, exhausted in our time. So not, it's just that, oh, it'd be really good to move beyond it, or the passage beyond is something that is worthy for thought because we're progressive intellectuals or something. No, we arrive at a moment in history where the age of Rousseau that we still inhabit is virtually uninhabitable. We can't really believe it anymore. And that's why Derrida says, am I taking advantage of the we when I say we no longer want either Eurocentrism or anti-Eurocentrism? in these Rousseauist shapes. We don't want it because we can't believe it. And it, everything about it strikes us as, in a certain way, beyond credible, no longer credible. And so there's this huge question then. Yes, Stephen, how do we think otherwise? How do we begin to think otherwise? And I will just say that everything that Derrida did was an effort to engage with that question. And he found it very complicated. It's not a straightforward matter of setting out a new agenda or a new definition or a new program or a new project or giving up on reason or, declaring oneself for the illogical or the irrational or for whatever. Absolutely not. But nothing simple in this either, unfortunately. But there are certain things that one might begin to think, I think, one might begin to think about. For example, that instead of thinking that there is just one universal history of humanity from primitive origin to civilized rational end, where all humanity is somewhere on that one line, that linear history with Europe at the front, one has to begin to think that there are radically particular histories, cultural singularities, and that Europe has its cultural singularity too, with its Eurocentric and anti-Eurocentric programs. But every other culture will have its conception of what it is to be a human being, that, as it were, belongs culturally to its heritage and its philosophy, and that these are profoundly things that, as it were, one can engage with, learn from, think about, great opportunities for thinking and rethinking what it is to be a human being. All politics, I believe, presupposes a conception of what it is to be a human being. And what we can see perhaps in our time is that it's becoming clearer that the history of the world is a history of human conceptions of humanity, expressing themselves in these cultural ways. And so a movement of what one might call an anthropological pluralism, away from what you called quite rightly the essentialism, as it were, of the old Western tradition, where, as it were, an essence of man was identified. It's the same in every culture. And yes, there will, I'm going to get tangled up in certain kinds of cultural relativisms here, unavoidably, because these are cultural expressions of the human in which what it is to be human is understood differently. But there is, again, I would go back to Heidegger to find something that can hold this together without a kind of essentialism, indeed opposed to a kind of essentialism. In Heidegger's thought that the human is the being whose own being is a question for it. And that's why there is this plurality. It's that there's not just one thing that it means to be human, but its own being in question is, as it were, what singularizes it in each of these cultural shapes.
So this notion of cultural plurality that you just sort of explicated and raises these really fascinating issues about cultural identity, cultural difference, and of course, one of the ways in which this is a relevant topic of discussion is with the matter of colonialism and debates around colonialism. And I do want to touch on that topic before we conclude today, but before asking about your views about the colonialism debate and how the kind of philosophical attitude that you're adopting to this question of Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism views the status of that debate. I want to see if your co-author, Cristobal, happens to have anything to say, or if you two want to have a little discussion, or if there's questions from the audience.
Cristobal is in every respect, a good person to respond to that question on colonialism. If he doesn't mind my saying, it's not simply an intellectual matter for him, because Cristobal has a part Mexican heritage. And so the idea of opposition to Eurocentrism which doesn't just come from Europe, has been profoundly important in his thinking. And in fact, as a matter of fact, in a kind of extraordinary accident of fate, this paper came about because Cristobal and I were teaching together in a classroom together about about Eurocentrism, and the students could hear me saying that Derridian thought of beyond Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism, but they will have heard from Cristobal. Maybe he's not quite with us right now, I'm not sure. Cristobal being much more positively affirming the necessity and importance of an anti-Eurocentrism. And we had a student, in fact, from China, who said, are you two, one on this? Isn't Cristobal sort of more saying, yes, we got to go beyond Eurocentrism, but we don't need to go beyond anti-Eurocentrism. And Glendinning, aren't you, as it were, the one who's taking this other position? And we were a bit stumped in the class for a moment, until it struck me very firmly that I was lodged inside this discussion about the Rousseauist conception and a Eurocentrism and an anti-Eurocentrism that belong to that Rousseauism. And Cristobal, because of his own formation and his own interests, was also hearing Eurocentrism from outside Europe, from the colonized people, not just the colonizers. So colonizers who could have regarded themselves as great achievers of freedom fighters, as it were, missionary people who take freedom across the world, or Europeans who regard themselves as unacceptable in this domain. But right outside Europe, for example, from Mexico or from the Americas, Cristobal having an ear for what is outside Europe in that other sense, in coming from elsewhere. So perhaps, I don't know if Cristobal, you were happy to say something, but Stephen's question was about colonization and that question as it arises for philosophy today and how you would take that on.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, and thanks, Stephen. I as Simon was saying just now, I think that is the question about colonialism, the phenomenon of colonization, I think, was central to the initial worries that we had when we started articulating the paper. I think that one of the things that we are trying to do in the paper, especially when we look at the second variation of what it would mean to go beyond Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism, is try to incorporate some of the voices that have made the point most forcefully. And I think that a post-colonial thinker like Enrique Dussel is pretty central here, right? I mean, in essence, the argument that Enrique Dussel presents is that Europe deifies itself, right? But in deifying itself and linked to the kind of Nietzschean idea of the death of God, right? And the transition away from modernity, in deifying itself, Europe is also somehow killing itself, right? Might be because of an issue of petrification, right? Petrification in the sense that it relies on the old sedimented prejudices and it cannot really move beyond them. Or it might be because of some kind of, let's say, having lost all perspective, right? As one would expect a God losing all perspective of its own humanity, as it were, right? And I think that part of the reason, again, why we try to incorporate the Dussel is not just to say that that this is wrong. It's also to say that, in a sense, it is right, right? The Dusselian the Dusserlian argument. But I suppose it is right in a way that we would want to qualify, and that we would want to qualify precisely because we don't think that this petrification is so absolute that it just entirely takes over the discourses that, or the openness, as it were, that exists within the discourses of Europe itself, right? And Europe's own.
And I think it would be fair to say that Dussel himself, because he's so informed by that European philosophy, is almost a living example of that non-petrification, right? You know, although we struggled to, when we thought about identifying a position of anti-Eurocentrism in Europe with him, because he's not, you know, in many respects, he is not European. But because of his thinking, because of the history of his thinking and the kinds of texts that are so important for him, there is also a sense in which he is a sort of European thinker too, at least in a certain potential way. That is, say, he belongs to this possibility of a thought beyond, from within, in a certain way. So I think that's why Dussel can be included, although we must say we're both a bit unsure about our doing so. But that non-petrification as being in a certain way alive in him is something I think that we both appreciate.
Let me quickly just get at the issue slightly different way, and I'm interested to hear what both of you would say in response. So for those who are unaware, Simon today is coming from in Oxford. And one of the things that's been going on recently in Oxford with regard to this issue of colonialism is a book that was published by Nigel Biggar on colonialism. And I haven't read Nigel's book, so I don't have an opinion about it personally myself. But in reading about what people are saying about the book, one of the things that I've been noticing is that people who are critical of the book say, well, there's some sort of methodological or ideological problem with Nigel's or Biggar's approach, in that he seems to be drawing up a tally sheet. So on one side, he has all the bad things that the British Empire did. And then on the other hand, he has all the genuinely good things that it did. And the supposition seems to be that the critics are saying is that Biggar thinks that coming to a determination about whether or not the British Empire and colonialism was good or not is a matter of weighing up the sums. Now, I don't know if that's actually fair to Biggar's position, but my question to you is that suppose that is in fact the approach that Biggar has. If there's something wrong about that approach, what's wrong? And philosophically speaking, what is that kind of mindset missing on either end? Either people who point to good things about empire, or those who just constantly bemoan the bad things about it. What's limited, if anything, about that frame of mind with regard to the issue?
You know, I think that's a really brilliant question. One of the things that we wanted to avoid when we were beginning to think about thinking beyond was that it was, as it were, just giving fair shares to each. Right, there's the Eurocentric bit, which perhaps has some good points, and the anti-Eurocentric bit in Europe, which perhaps has some good points. And that all you really need to do was to take a position which took only the good points of both and went ahead, and then you'd be beyond both. We were actually pretty aware that that was not what we were after, and yet in certain respects has a kind of a resemblance to it, because we're not, after all, giving up on everything European, and we're not, after all, just accepting that we are unacceptable and that everything good comes from the other, from the non-European. So, Stephen, you've raised a beautiful question, because on the one hand, that idea that we would, if you could imagine my giving the talk where I did it in the other way, which would be Eurocentrism had these good points and these bad points, and here are the good points. Anti-Eurocentrism had these good points and bad points, and here are the good points. We did both of those. Well, we weren't doing that. We were seeing that Eurocentrism and anti-Eurocentrism in Europe are based on these much deeper conceptions of history itself. That's our claim. And so, in fact, in my first paragraph, our first paragraph, I say this framing is far more basic to European thinking about Europe than a mere attitude one may or may not adopt. But of course, these attitudes that people adopt aren't unrelated to what we're talking about. We know when one today condemns European ways of thinking, or today celebrates European ways of thinking, you are taking an attitude which is involved inside what we're talking about. And when we talk about going beyond it, as it were, taking something from both 3 and 4, it again looks like we're taking the good bits of both. I'm really struck by this as to whether there's a good sort of formulation for seeing how this resemblance should be thought. Maybe, Cristobal, you have an idea on that.
Well, I do have an idea, but might be, I suppose, slightly disappointing. I'm not familiar with the bigger book either, so I mean, I don't know if what I'm about to say is entirely correct, but it seems to me like an essential part of the argument that we're putting forth is that we would want to try to think of a beyond for Europe, where that Europe is sort of caught in a Rousseauist self-understanding, right? The kind of Europe that we would want to think beyond is that Rousseauist Europe, right? Where Europe, on the one hand, sort of pats itself in the back and says, "Oh, I've done so great," and on the other hand, right, it sort of looks at itself in the mirror and sort of wags a finger at itself and accuses itself of how bad it has been, right? I suppose, again, a central part of the argument that we are trying to construct is to say, well, is there a way in which we can think of Europe as being able to move beyond either one of these motivations, right? And it seems to me like then the calculative dimension of the one that would try to say, well, let's look at the achievements on the one end and at the crimes on the other, and let's sort of weigh them out. She seems to me to misunderstand the nature of the of our attempt in a sense, right? Because we're not trying to weigh the achievements or the crimes of Europe. Rather, we're trying to think, what is it going to be like to think beyond that paradigm that would have thought of Europe in terms of its crimes or its achievements, right? I mean, I'm not entirely sure whether that sort of sounds...
Well, it's not bad, Cristobal, but it has a problem that in order for this beyond to be for Europe, it's a Europe with all its memories, good and bad. And you're not going to forget them because they won't forget you. And but I think what's clear, Stephen, and what I would say is the proper answer to you is that whatever resemblances there are, we should see that Bigger's work lies very squarely within the old paradigm, that he tries to say, well, of course, this movement towards reason, culture, civilization has had some bad moments and isn't without criticism and so on. Why would one expect it to take place without criticism? But by and large, it's still this movement, which is a sort of European project made good. And so I would say that, you know, he may want a calculating balance, but he's definitely coming down on one side, and it's squarely within the old program. And I think if our work was brought into a critical relation with his, it would be emphasizing how far he remains absolutely solidly within that old paradigm, precisely the one we want to leave behind.
Thank you. Do you guys have time for one more question?
Sure.
Yeah. So it's a big question. So, you know, I don't expect you to solve the whole problem here. But we at certain points in the discussion, we ended up reverting to Heidegger. And one of the things, right, that is important about Heidegger, especially now, is his conception of technology, or rather, I suppose you could say his critique of technology. So I want to ask you both whether there is a sense in which, despite cultural particularity, despite the fact that you might think that all these different cultures have various conceptions of themselves and what it means to be a human being, in light of technology, or in light of living in what Heidegger would consider a technological age, there is now a sort of universality that's in a way back in work. I mean, China, you might think, just isn't the way China was 1,000 years ago, right? And so maybe is there a sense in which there's now a kind of monoculture, or a sort of universality, albeit a pernicious one, that is in a sense sort of coming, that is back at work.
I think this is a superbly important point. Step back to the way I put it some time ago in some kind of affirmation of anthropological pluralism, that you have distinct cultures, each one with their own way of thinking what it is to be a human being, and the culture being, as it were, this singular expression of that singular understanding, and their politics being connected to that, and ours too. Well, there's one absolutely significant fundamental difference to the European Western human, which is its character of globalization, or what is perhaps better called worldwideization, the movement worldwide of its world. And that is incomparable. I mean, there have been empires before, but never before, and as it were, something which has become literally planetary. So that the reach of the European world is way, way beyond Europe. And it certainly obviously includes Stephen, are you in America right now?
Yeah, I'm on the East Coast, yeah.
Right, so the whole of North America, Canada too, and in Latin America too. Obviously, Latin America, the conquests by Europeans in settler colonial occupations. So not only through that kind of movement of human beings in colonial conquests, but as you perhaps beautifully put it, Stephen, a technological reach that is spread worldwide now, so that, as it were, the form of world disclosure that has come to belong to the European is now global and planetary, and this, as it were, produces a complication to any happy talk of cultural pluralism or anthropological pluralism, because there's an absolute occupation. I mean, like a settler colonial occupation, a kind of absolute capture of every other within that technological way of disclosing whatever is. So I think you're right to bring in Heidegger there, and we could bring in Heidegger with respect to the point just made, but we could also, without Heidegger, as it were, perhaps think about processes of globalization and of worldwideization of a European world, which in my work I've connected to it, not only its Greek philosophical heritage, but also its Christian heritage under the name of Japheth, Japheth's world. Japheth was the son of Noah, who in the dispersal after the flood is his place is Europe. So you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth covering the space of Europa, Africa, and Asia. And Japheth means spreading out, literally means, so, or enlarge. And God willed that Japheth would enlarge. And in the Hebrew, that means enlarge will enlarge, because the word itself literally means enlarge. So enlarging or spreading out is precisely what the Europeans do. And the European world has worldwideized in that history. And this means that nobody's untouched. Literally nobody on Earth is untouched, even if they've never been colonized in the kind of, classical 16th, 17th, 18th century ways. The Chinese, for example, yeah.
Thank you. Well, unless you have any other further concluding remarks you'd like to make, I think we could conclude there. Is there anything maybe you'd like to just say a word about your 2-volume Routledge work that just came out? Because it's a very similar set of questions you're dealing with there. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to just say to the audience about what you were up to in that work and how it bears on what you had to say today. But
well, I think what I've done today in my work with Cristobal develops out of the work of that book, which is called Europe, A Philosophical History. And a philosophical history is precisely this idea of a history of humanity that Europeans had developed that has this Rousseauist shape that I've talked about today, and typically understood as a history of civilization or of human societies moving from primitive forms to a fully developed rational form, and whether that's a Hegelian kind of vision or a Rousseauist vision or a Marxist vision of an end of history where we've finally self-realized as the kinds of beings we can be. That's a philosophical history, and it's that philosophical history that I tell in those 2 volumes. Not unrelated to what we did today.
well, Simon, thank you for taking the time to join us at the seminar today, and thank you, Cristobal, as well. Really fascinating talk, wonderful lecture, and I'm sure that the people are going to really enjoy this when it's posted up on the Woolf YouTube site. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen.
Thank
All
you.
Thank you to Woolf.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Cristobal.